Good evening, platform viewers. We are back another Monday evening at 7:30. Tonight we have a special broadcast, and I would say all my broadcasts are special, but in this particular case, the broadcast tonight is of a sensitive nature as we're talking about grief and healing after losing a child, after the death of a child. And it's a particularly sensitive topic. And I have a wonderful, brave, and courageous woman who will be our guest tonight. And I want to introduce her, all of our viewers to her. Her name is Stephanie, and I want to make sure I'm bringing her up. And this is Stephanie. So, our viewers, this is a special treat for us tonight because we're able to dive into this topic together with candor, but also with sensitivity. And so I definitely want to thank our guests, all of viewers, as usual. We want to hear from you. Please chat in your comments or your questions. We want you to be encouraged and be a part of this discussion. So without further delay, I want to bring in our guest, Stephanie, and I want to open up the floor to her to give her the space to share her story. And as a mother, as a parent who's lost a child.
Okay, Natalie, thank you for having me on. As you mentioned, it is a sensitive topic. It's one that I feel comfortable talking about. It's been more than 2 decades now since the loss of my child, so I've had some time to go through the full grieving process. I had a son actually on Thanksgiving Day of 1994 who was born with a rare congenital heart defect called tetralogy of Fallot. And he also had, along with that, something called pulmonary atresia, which means the left pulmonary artery was disconnected. So with the congenital heart defect and the pulmonary atresia, it made his condition very dire. He was born in the Naval Hospital he was born actually in Fort Belvoir at DeWitt Army Hospital, but we were immediately transferred to Bethesda Naval because of his condition. And then he underwent heart surgery at 11 days old at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And we stayed there for about a month. So we came home just before Christmas, maybe 2 days before Christmas. And then I'd say about 4.5 months of age, he caught something called respiratory syncytial virus, which is RSV. And to most kids, that's more like a common cold. But because of his condition, it was a lot more severe and had a lot harsher impact on him. And so we went back in the hospital into Bethesda Naval for quite some time, and he started experiencing more congestive heart failure and passed away shortly thereafter. So that is, I'm sure we'll go into further detail with your questions, but that, is a summary of actually what happened.
Okay. And I appreciate you sharing that because I mean, again, I certainly want to, yield and make sure I recognize the courage that it takes to share your personal story and share your loss with all of us. Um, my follow-up question for our viewers is just when what was the experience like? Like, what were your feelings? What were your thoughts when you got the news, or maybe you were right there and you saw him expire, your child expire? What were your thoughts and your feelings at that moment?
So the circumstances were they were not the most ideal, I will say. It was I noticed that he was very fussy at home. We were leaving. We had called the hospital and told them that we were bringing him in because they had sent us home with this oxygen tent, but it wasn't the same as it was in the hospital. Like the tent at home, it was hard to keep it cool. It was hot. I wasn't as skilled on knowing whether or not the pulse ox was reading correctly or not. So it was I knew something was wrong. So I said, I think we should leave and go to the hospital. So we got in the car and didn't get far, not even 3 miles from the house when I started to see all of those things that they told you to look for. The puffy eyes, the red eyes, the blueness in the lips. And I knew that something was going wrong. And so my first um, emotions were just like despair and helplessness, because even though we had both taken that infant CPR class, I just couldn't remember a thing. So the first emotion, knowing that something was going terribly wrong that day in the car, was like despair and helplessness. And then as we got to the hospital, it was just like shock. At some point, I found out that he was actually not breathing when we got to the hospital, but I wasn't certain of that. So there was shock, and then just those were my first emotions. So
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that, and being candid. I think from what I've read from either read in like psychology journals and also through my own personal experiences with loss, there's a numbness, I think, and then like you said, a shock, where it's like I just can't even wrap my mind around how this is really happening. Um, and then I think you also bring up a unique challenge because he was born with some medical challenges. So it was trying to also navigate the nursing care that was needed as a parent, and trying to figure that out, and that just adds to the fear, I can imagine, and the stress of trying to manage it, and then and ultimately having to experience that. And so, did in the midst of your feelings and in your experience, at any point that you ever feel like a sense of guilt or responsibility, um, when your child passed away?
and absolutely, for a really, 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 really long time, the guilt did not subside for years. In fact, I'm not so sure that it doesn't come in small waves even now. And the reason is because that, like I said, we were in the hospital with the RSV. He had tested negative for that, but he couldn't stay out of the tent. Every time they tried to wean him from the tent, he needed more oxygen to go back in. So, the circumstances were such that the doctor wanted us to get a catheterization, a cardiac catheterization, because he was thinking that we may need to go back to Philadelphia to have a second surgery a little earlier than he was supposed to. And just the irony of things is that we were scheduled to go into the cath lab, and there was a baby who was first case simply because she was a newborn, and my son was second case. And that first case had an emergency and ended up staying in the cath
Mm,
lab all day long. And so, because of that, the doctor was scheduled to go out on leave. It was right before Easter. Like that week was going to be Palm Sunday, and the next week was Easter. And so the doctor was scheduled to go out on vacation. So he said, I'll tell you what we'll do is we'll send you home, um, and I'll bring you back after my vacation, and we'll get you scheduled for the calf then and see if it's possible for you to go back to Philadelphia to have the valve replaced. So, so we went home, and I did speak up. I said, well, I thought we wouldn't go home if he needed oxygen, that you wouldn't. He said, well, we'll have a company come out and they'll set you up with a tent at home, and it'll be just like this. But it wasn't. So I second guessed that decision. I second guessed, why did I go home? I
mm,
probably was tired of being in the hospital for a month. If I weren't so fatigued, I would have never, taken him up on the offer to go home. So there were just so many circumstances. And then the fact that we were scheduled for the calf and it didn't happen. And then, I noticed that morning that something was wrong with him, but I didn't leave to go to the hospital for hours later. I was trying to reach for the doctor and reach the doctor and wait for him to call back. So you see all those things and you start to second guess, where did I go wrong? Why wasn't I more proactive?
Mm,
And so, yes, I dealt with those decisions for years and years.
yeah. And thank you for sharing that. And I think there's just so many, like you said, there's so many layers to that experience because it's the constant hospital visits, the traveling, the information that's being dumped on you, the constant changes, or we're trying this therapy, we're trying this treatment, or it wasn't a success, or it was a success. We have to change this, reschedule this, and that in and of itself is a lot to handle. Before and then have to go through that for months on end, and you're tired, and then have to face and always having this looming thought or pervasive thought like I'm going through this at any moment something happened to my child. So how did this loss affect the other relationships in your life, whether it be your employer, your spouse, your family members, your parents? How did this experience and then ultimately the loss of your child affect all the other relationships in your life?
So I would say that in some cases, I became closer to some people and further away from others. You know, my sister was a big help. She had also lost a child. I remember her talking to me about her losing her child. That was a way that we could come closer. I had family around me. My spouse at the time did not deal with grief well at all. He didn't deal with the entire ordeal well at all. I mean, he pretty much shut down in terms of communication the entire time we were in Philadelphia. And then when we came back home, he was in the military, so he was away in North Carolina, stationed there, and so that was more strain. And then the death was just too much strain. So I would say the biggest impact it had on was my marriage. It put a big strain on that, and we tried to address that through counseling and having another child, and which I'm so blessed that we made that decision to have a second child, well, a third child actually at that point. But it would have been, we had one son at home, and then this son passed away, and so we had
Yeah.
another. um, but anyway, so that was hard. That was probably the hardest part. It was probably the beginning of the end of my marriage, because it
Mm,
put such.
mm, mm. Um, so in sharing that the strain and the toll that it took on the other relationships in your life, I know that you mentioned um, counseling, family support. Um, what did how did you seek help in the midst of that? It was so much going on, so much pain. Everyone is handling it their own way, whether it was healthy or unhealthy, but people doing what they can. Um, how did you how did you cope with all of this going on?
So, like I said, my ex-husband was in the military. So someone in the military actually reached out to me, to us, and he didn't want to do the counseling. I did it a couple of times, and participated in one group. I did not stay in it long term. Maybe if I did, I could have gotten through my cycles of grief a bit sooner, but I didn't stay in it long. I guess I just had a lot going on that I didn't slow down and take that time to really address the grief and the trauma and the loss like I should have. I just sort of jumped right back into things and kept going. So
Hmm.
that's certainly not what I would recommend for anyone else today. But
Hmm.
I did go. I only went maybe 3 or 4 times at the most.
Hmm. Okay. All right. And for those of us who are just tuning in and joining us, again, this is the platform, and we have our guest Stephanie on, and we're talking about healing and grief after losing a child. So we're talking about um, losing a child to death and the grieving and the healing that takes place and how it affects the lives. So if you are tuning in for the first time, this is what we're talking about, and we want to hear from you all out there. If you have a question, if you have a comment, please chat it in. And we certainly will look forward to you would participate in this conversation. And so, Stephanie, what did you feel like you needed most from the loved ones, from the family, the friends that were in your life during that time? What do you feel like you needed the most from them?
So honestly, it's funny because you want people around you and you want space at the same time, right?
Mm,
So you don't want to be alone. And so just knowing that I wasn't in the house alone, I had my parents there, I had my niece who was like a sister to me there, I had, you know, lots of people there. So just having those people around was comforting, but at the same time I needed space. I couldn't process all of the information. So I needed some time to process, and I couldn't answer all the questions that were coming at me. So uh, that's mostly what I needed.
mhm,
Yeah, and another thing is, it was interesting because you people know that he had, open heart surgery, and he had all these problems, and we were always in the hospital, and we had, these oxygen tanks and stuff that I was taking with me everywhere. So it's almost like for people, it was like, well, this was always possible. This was something that we knew was all, he was so sick that, that it wasn't shock to them, but it was very much shock to me because I deal in information. So as long as I have information I can process, so I listened to the doctor when they said, this is what it is. We will put this heart valve in. We'll bring him back at 6 months of age because we're going to connect the pulmonary artery. Then it needs to grow a little bit, right? And so they couldn't connect it when he was first born. It was only like a millimeter in diameter or something like that. So they, and then they said, and after that, he'll be fine. And once we connect that pulmonary artery, he'll be fine. Maybe about 10, 12 years of age, we'll replace that heart valve once the heart is full grown. And there's no reason that he shouldn't have a long and healthy life. So while others might have thought, well, this was inevitable, to me, it wasn't. It was as much a shock as if someone had called me on the phone and said your son was in a car accident and he passed away, or something tragic and unexpected. That's how tragic and unexpected it was for me. So I really did need that level of understanding.
mm. Um, and I think that's very profound that you shared that, because I think those um, undoubtedly the individuals in your life, I'm sure, loved you very much and was and hope for the best, but your perspective is so different when it's you and your child and your experience. And when you're on the outside looking in, even if your heart is filled with compassion, it's a different experience. You have a different outlook. And so I think it's very interesting that you shared, like, it wasn't a shock for me. It was a shock for me, rather,
Yeah.
because you had all the hope in the world that it was going to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
You take step A, step B, step C, and everything will be okay. And it sounds like those around you may had a different view, seeing the constant hospital visits, the surgeries, and their outlook wasn't maybe not as your own. So, what would you have to say that during this time, how faith and spirituality participated in your experience? How did these things be a part of your experience?
So at first, it did not. I was very defiant too. So like it was Palm Sunday. Well, he passed away the day after Palm Sunday.
Mm,
And on that Palm Sunday, we got him christened in church. We took
mm,
him down to King George at Little Ark, and he was dedicated to Christ. And his godparents, my brother and sister-in-law, stood up for him. And then the very next day, he passed away. So the pastor that did the christening, that did the dedication, um, came to the house, and he thought it was so profound that God allowed him to dedicate the child to him and then the very next day call him home. And at the time, I wasn't feeling any of that. I
mhm,
was like, so, there's no purpose in this. There's no gratification in this, that God did not put this child here to be cut on and poked and prodded for 5.5 months for nothing, just to have him pass away. So I was very much turning away. And I realized then where I was in my walk,
mm,
um, in faith is why. But as I got more, I'd say, Bible based, and I got into a different experience with church and a different experience with God's word and a different faith experience, I began to realize that there are no mistakes, that
mhm,
God does not make mistakes, and that um, we weren't supposed to go to the cath lab that day. And if we had went to the cath lab that day, then it maybe we would have went back to Philadelphia, but God was ready for him. And I wasn't supposed to leave that morning. Maybe if I had left that morning, I might have made it all the way to Bethesda, but still God was ready for him. And maybe if I did know the CPR like I thought I did, maybe I would have saved his life that day. But in the end, God was ready for him. And once you have that understanding, and you understand that everything was as it was supposed to be, then you understand that God's will is going to come into fruition no matter what. So
mhm,
it took me a while to get to that point. I will tell you, I was very defiant at first,
mhm,
extremely. I didn't know anything about God's will or purpose at all.
mhm.
So
And yeah, and you know what? I think that touches so many. There's so many core tenets of our faith, of Christian faith, that touches on when you're dealing with death and loss. That's really where the rubber meets the road. And I think also it's okay to be upset and to be angry and to feel like, you know what, this, I don't want to hear anything about, this is the plan. My child is gone, and I think that reality needs to be acknowledged and respected. And I don't think it makes you an unbeliever or some wayward Christian. I think you are a human being made in the image of God with emotions and feelings, and loss is very real. Even those who have, if you want to actually create such a thing as levels, if you want to say, hey, this person is in a different space or a different level or level 10 or however you want to do it, define it in that spirituality. I think when you experience loss on any level, it has an effect to you. It does have an effect. And I think it's important that you share that, hey, I'm like that, and I think it's such a difficult thing to navigate and walk through with anybody who's lost someone that they love, whether it be a child, a spouse, a friend, or whatever. Um, it's quite difficult to walk through that with anyone, and I think it's okay to acknowledge that you're angry and you're like, I would rather have my child here, and I think that makes you human. Um, And I think God understands that, and I don't think there's any, something wrong with that. That's part of your process. And I think it's good. Um, and I really, if there are any clergy members out there or counselors tuning in, if you can chat or comment on, how do you best support a man or woman dealing with loss and grief without minimizing the reality that it hurts. It absolutely just plain old hurts when you lose somebody,
Absolutely.
no matter what kind of faith you have that can move mountains. It hurts. It just hurts. So we would love to hear from you if you're out there. And while our viewers are out there getting their comments and their questions together, I think it's important to talk about like how these comments made by friends, family, people who are well-meaning, how that kind of what should they say or should they not say or do during that time when they're trying to support you or anyone who's lost someone. I mean, what are your thoughts?
So the one thing I would say is people want that you got to recognize that people really want to help, and
Hmm.
and they mean well. I can deal with anything except someone putting limits on my grief, right?
Hmm.
So 5 years from now, or for some, especially someone who's lost a spouse or something like that, they life goes on. You've got to move on. You don't feel that way, right? And so I would expect that someone should be able to go through their own process in their own time and heal in their own time in their own way. So the worst thing that they can say is, you've got to move on.
Hmm.
That's what you would hear, you know, time after time again. And so
Hmm.
people just need to grieve in their own time. And I think that, you know,
Yeah.
to me is one of the worst things is people want to put limits on it. They may just want to see you happy again, and they
Hmm.
want to see you moving on with your life again, but at the same time they're putting limitations on you. And I know for me, I would start to feel bad if I saw myself like the evening came or the afternoon came and it was 4 o'clock and I realized that I had spent the whole day and I never once thought about my child. You know what I mean? And then I thought, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting about him. So you
Mm.
go through that process. So you just,
Wow.
you should not put limits on someone's grief.
Absolutely. And we have a viewer that chatted in. Sometimes it's best to be quiet and just sit with them. And I think that's I definitely think point. And we also have a viewer saying absolutely grief takes time to go through the process. And I really think that I'm so grateful. Our viewers are really chatting in. Another viewer just says, just pray for the person. And like she says, don't put limits on their grief. Did you have any comments on our viewers' comments?
I agree. I absolutely agree with them all. And like I told you earlier, knowing that I had someone in the house and I wasn't alone, I needed people around me, but I needed space at the same time. So I think the
Mhm.
person that chimed in and said sometimes just sitting there and being quiet is necessary because you don't want to be alone, but at the same time, there's not a lot of words that are going to bring you comfort either. Prayer, whoever said absolutely right, because the way I was feeling, right, um, especially with my faith and what had happened, I couldn't pray for myself at that time, right? I couldn't. And I knew that's what I needed to do or what I should have been doing, but that wasn't what I was doing. So if the people around me were praying for me, then they got me through because I couldn't do it myself. So,
Mhm.
so absolutely great comments from all.
Mhm. And I think that's so important. What you mentioned, that there were times where you couldn't pray for yourself. There's just times when you're weak, and just getting beat up, being on the front lines of your own issue, and that's when others can step in and be strong when you're weak. And I think not. And what else came to my mind while you were sharing how others can best support a someone going through grief is giving them, space. But also, not everyone can walk through with someone through this process. I don't think not everyone can do that. And I think um, there takes certain people to be able to restore people when they're broken. And not everyone can do that. And it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them. It's just, it takes quite a bit of patience and grace. Um, and discernment and wisdom to be able to restore somebody gently when they're on the front lines of their issue and they're dealing with their brokenness and they're dealing with their loss, or their concern. And not everyone can do that. And I think it's okay to acknowledge that, hey, I'm not the best person to walk through this with somebody,
Absolutely.
'cause I don't, like a bull in a china shop. I'm just going in and boom, boom, everything's crashing and falling down, and they have no idea. And so, so I think it's good to acknowledge that. And we had another comment from a viewer. Amen. Prayer changes our outcome. Absolutely. Prayer definitely changes things. Prayer definitely changes things. Are there any other, I guess when I'm thinking of it, any other like comments or experiences you had from the others around you, that really stuck out in your mind? And it could be anywhere along the process, whether it be going through, you were tending to his medical concerns from birth all the way through the first few months of his life, up to finding out that he has now passed away, and even afterwards. Were there some key comments or support, and it can be positive or negative, key moments or comments that really just stood out to you in that whole process?
Um, Let me think. I would I would say that when we were in the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, um, and I was staying at the Ronald McDonald House,
Mhm.
and um, there was someone there who had come from very far, because I want to say it was a country in South America, right?
Mhm.
Um, and and we were sharing. Their child had, I want to say it was called hypoplastic heart, something like that. It was a
Mhm.
very rare condition where one side of the heart doesn't form or something, and they reconstructed in this 3-step surgery, right?
Mhm.
And and this lady, uh, when we were at the Ronald McDonald House and we were having dinner one evening, she had said to me that no matter what happens, right, we'll get through. And
Mhm.
it was almost like she talked about my son as if the journey was going to come to an end, as if, you know, God had a higher purpose for the babies. And I remember thinking um, that this lady was being negative,
Mhm.
right? Um, and so when it wasn't right away, I didn't think about that, but a few months after, I thought about this woman telling me, um, no matter what, we'll be okay because God has a plan and a purpose for our children, right? And I just
Mhm.
remembered her saying that, and I think it was remembering that I first started to heal, that I first started to
Mhm.
say, And I don't know, I can't remember her name. I certainly remember what she looked like. I can't remember her name. I know she was from, I think, somewhere like South America or something like that. And I just remembered at the time thinking how negative she was being. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about, but
Mhm.
and then what you saw as negative initially was the words that actually helped you pull through, um, and start to turn the corner on your grief. So I just remember that. That's one thing.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think um, you just never know the power, the impact of words that we say. Our words can speak life, speak death, to the people that's on the other end, that's receiving these words. So we really have to be selective and discriminatory about the things we say and filter it through. And I'm grateful that her words initially, even though it seemed like it hurt, like, wow, why would she say something like that? I'm believing in full faith. My child's going to recover. It's going to be fine.
Right.
Why are you saying that?
Yeah.
That eventually coming back around to it, it was actually life giving. And I
Yeah.
think that shows just the power of words and also the revelation that God gives us through our experience. So, how do you think culture um, played a role in your grieving process? Um, can you speak to that?
Well, so you know, there's this belief that that our particular people do not seek mental health.
Hmm.
Like counseling is that's not what you need, right? You need to be strong. Um, uh, Sitting on someone's couch isn't going to do you any good. um, there's a lot of that, right? And I don't know if subconsciously that played a role in why I only went once or twice. Like, somehow mental health means that seeking help for your mental health is a sign of weakness, or it means that you need psychiatric help, you're crazy, you're this, you're that. There's that. Even still today there's that
Hmm.
belief that and that's not something we do, right? That's
Hmm.
for people. um so looking back, I think subconsciously, I think it did play a role. And I've always been this strong person, right? Who,
Hmm.
and the other thing is, I have friends, my closest friends, who will look at me as this source of strength and say, you know, every time I think I'm going through something, or every time I think that things are hard, or I'm in despair, I say, well, look at all Stephanie has gone through, because she's gone through so much and she's still standing and she's still strong. And I'm really not as strong as people may think. I definitely think that I could have benefited from people to talk to, um, uh, you know, a long time ago. I think that today it's more that more people are seeking counseling because the church, the Black church in particular, has started offering more counseling through the church, which sort
Hmm.
of changed the dynamic on how our culture views getting help, mental health, help and counseling. So
Yeah. And
I would say,
okay. You know what, and I think is you bring up a lot of hot button topics when you bring that up, and I think that's important. Speaking about the Black church now, I'm bringing in more professional counseling resources, but there's still the stigma in the African American community. And I just share my opinion, especially when it comes to women. Women, we strong Black women, we endure. we just, whatever it is, come hell or high water, we're going to rise to the top and survive. And I
Yeah,
do think there's a lot of truth in that, but I think it's okay not to be strong all the time, because in our weakness, He's made strong. And I also think it takes quite a bit of strength to recognize when you need help. And I think we should be a paradigm shift and looking at humility as a strength and not a weakness. And it's okay to say, you know what, this is just too much. I can't bear it. I need help. And there's a strength in that. And I think culturally, because I'm part of the same culture, and there I haven't really seen too many examples of where humility was seen as a strength. It was a weakness. Asking for help is seen as a weakness, and I think we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot, because that's unhealthy. Because we're human beings, and we live in community, and we go through things, and there's a purpose for those in our lives. Um, and I will say that, we have our faith in God, and God is mighty and He can do anything. But He uses people to carry out His will on earth. So we do
absolutely.
have an important part to play. And I think the other side of that coin is, well, people say, well, I don't need, I can just go to God in prayer and that's it. I don't need anybody. I think that's kind of similarly, I don't really need help. I got the word of God. I can get in my prayer closet. I don't need medicine. I don't need surgeries. I don't need anything. I can just, go to God in prayer. And I know I'm probably, igniting the chat lines by saying that, but I think there's a role and there's a purpose in in both things. I think God gives us a beautiful mind that we're able to invent, and be innovative as people and have modern medicine on our side, but there's a healing power and there's a supernatural greatness and force in God, that we absolutely can tap into. So I'm not saying one negates the other. I think they're both very much real and present
Absolutely.
and have purpose and power. And so, just to turn back to our viewers is chatting in. People have also gone through different hurts and woundedness, and this will also affect the healing process of the individual. Absolutely. I didn't know if you want to comment on that, Stephanie, at all.
Um, yeah, no, I agree 100%, absolutely, with what they're saying. So,
Okay, and
yeah,
we have another comment that came in. Thank you. And our viewer says, Stephanie, the fact that you can share your story is strength. This will help someone. Amen to that. Amen to that. Isn't that
absolutely,
absolutely? Isn't that what the
absolutely.
platform
Thank
is
you for that.
about?
Mhm.
That's what the platform is about. So that we can show strength and courage and draw on it from others and their experience. We have another viewer that chatted in, because we take on everyone else's issues and problems, we become afraid to address our own. Interesting comment.
That
Interesting
is
comment.
true. That is absolutely true. I mean, even not just the problems of others, but in particular our children, right? Like you take your children to every doctor's appointment they're supposed to have, but then you miss your own, and
Hmm.
we're so used to taking care of everything and everyone else that and that we lose sight of taking care of ourselves. And once you realize that if you don't take care of yourself, you can't be there for others. And I've learned that this past year. I was pretty healthy for all of my life until this past year. I've had a number of health things come in, and I realized I have to start taking better care of myself, or I won't be here to take care of anyone. So
Absolutely, absolutely. And another viewer chatted in. It took me 5 years to overcome my grief or heartbrokenness after I got a divorce, but I had to work one day at a time to finally heal. Any thoughts or comments on that?
I understand. I do. I mean, I was losing a lot all at once, you know. So
Mm,
a husband, a house, just
mm,
everything all at once, and it took time, and it, you know, it took someone else. I remember the moment that I called my best friend on the phone, and all I said was hello. And she was just ecstatic because she heard something in my voice that I had finally come through to the other side. And it took, you know, someone actually telling me that I was valuable, because you feel like someone threw you aside, they threw you out. You don't understand, you know, your unworthiness, and you start to feel unworthy, or you know, and undervalued. And it took someone actually telling me, you know, you are an awesome person with enormous value. That I it took a while for me. I couldn't see that in myself. And I remember the conversation with someone at work who, you know, just said, look, we've sat down for 30 minutes, and in that 30 minutes you've talked to me about sports, politics, technology, life, religion, everything. And he was like, you have so much to give to someone, and that was his loss, not yours. And so it does take time. It's hard to see that in yourself, and it took,
mhm.
you know, people, you know, sort of revalidating me so that I could start to see myself as worthy again. So
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Um, and again, I think there's so many golden nuggets in what you just said. There's so many golden nuggets, but I think the again I mentioned this earlier, the power of words to speak life and encouragement. And I think, and I'm grateful for this individual that poured in that life to you, to say, you know what, you're doing a great job, you're a strong woman, you're awesome. Because I think about, even on a different note but kind of similar experience, as a parent, I always feel like I'm getting a C or a D. I always feel that way.
I
But
feel like
it
I'm getting
feels
an F. So it don't.
I always feel like I'm getting a C or a D or an F sometimes. But and I kind of brought it up as a joke one day, and I asked my children, like, well, how do you think mommy is doing? How do you think? And they said, mommy, you get an A. You get an A plus. And that really gave me a lot of life, because I always feel like I'm not doing enough. I'm not being good enough. There's more I can be doing. There's something that I'm missing. There's something that I'm lacking. And that was so life giving to me. And that was more on a lighter note. But we're talking about, of course, something as serious as grief and bearing and going through life, difficult challenges when you're losing someone that you love to death. But you'll beat up yourself so much. And it feels so affirming and so good and life giving for someone to say, you know what, you're doing an awesome job. I think you're a wonderful woman. Even if you've fallen apart and crying and all over the floor, and it's like, you know what, it took a lot of strength to let it all out, and be okay with that. And I think what our viewer brought up, far as divorce and thing, and what I'm hearing from that, and also our viewer also chatted in, yes, divorce hits very deep at your self esteem. What I'm hearing from that is that grief comes in all different forms, and
Absolutely.
losing a relationship, going through a divorce, is a loss. It's a grief. We're here in this broadcast, of course, we're talking about losing a child, and the grief with that, but we all experiences other losses in our life, and they don't have death is not the only loss. Physical death.
Absolutely.
So the death of a relationship, losing a job, whether or losing an opportunity, or failing out of school, whatever we're going through, it's a loss. And
It is.
grief does occur. Did you have any other comments about the viewer sharing about divorce hitting at the self esteem?
Um, it does. It does. But uh, again, I wish that uh, I had known then at the time
Mhm.
where to seek that validation from.
Mm.
Because once you learn that if you seek validation from God first and you
Mhm.
worry about being pleasing in His sight, then
Mhm.
you start to see your self-worth. Once you recognize who you are in God, then you can start to regain your self-esteem and know your value and know your purpose. And at the time, I just didn't, you know,
Mm.
I
Mhm.
just did not have that relationship that I have now.
Mhm.
So,
You know what? And and I praise God for your vulnerability. We all a work in progress. Nobody has arrived. Nobody has arrived. Our
absolutely.
righteousness were filthy rags. So nobody has arrived. We're all a work in progress. And we thank God for His mercy and His grace. Um, and a viewer chatted in, when you become one flesh with someone, it's not just a physical thing, but spiritual. And that's why he hates divorce. I mean, absolutely. We know that God hates divorce. And it's a very painful experience. It's a very painful experience. I didn't know if you had any other comments you wanted to share with regarding this viewer's comment.
Well, this one is a tough one
Mm-hmm.
because I won't even go too much into it because I know it's kind of off topic, but you struggle with when the covenant is broken and
Mm-hmm.
and when someone is free to remarry and I've heard different things that unless the man, even in cases of adultery or other things that were forbidden, that that you always must be ready to reconcile, and that the covenant is there until such time as the man remarry. I mean, I've heard all sorts of takes on that, and so I can't. That's a whole
Mm-hmm.
topic in and of itself. But it's one that I've definitely struggled with trying to understand when your covenant is actually broken and when you're
Mm-hmm.
actually free.
And I, and I really think this is, I know that it's off topic and we're going a little off to the left, but I think there's a need to talk about this topic on another broadcast and bring it up because so many people are experiencing that. Grief and loss is real, whether it's through the death of a marriage, death of a spouse, a child, a friend, and the list goes on. It is real, and I think it's important that we acknowledge that. And so we should bring this up again because I do think divorce is a hot topic that needs to be unpacked a little bit more. But to get back to what we're talking about tonight and losing a child, do you have any advice for any parent that's experienced the death of a child? From speaking from your experience, do you have any advice for them?
So I would say don't force yourself or let anyone else force you to put a limit on your grief and on your time. Like if 10 years has gone by and all of a sudden you become overwhelmed with grief and loss, um, then that's fine. If in 2 days you feel like you can get up and move forward, then that's fine. I just think that whatever you need to feel, it's a process. It's your process. It's not anyone else's process. And I do say that seeking solace in in others that have gone through the same experience, seeking help, talking, getting into some kind of a support group is something that would be very helpful. I know the one group I participated in, the loss of a child. There is no degree. There were people who had had a miscarriage, so they never got to meet their child.
Mm,
There were people who had lost a child shortly after birth. The child didn't make it through the first year of life. There were some people who had lost a child, in their teenage years. and some even later in life, right? And there is no comparison, right, to,
Mm,
well, you didn't actually get to meet the child. That's in itself has its own set of
mm-hmm,
grief, because you wonder the guilt there, for the woman that was carrying the child, right? What did I do? Why couldn't I carry this child to fruition? Or the parent that wants to know, should I have not given him the keys, to go to drive the car that night? Or for me, my situation, my circumstances. So I definitely would say that it doesn't matter. Um, the loss of a child is a loss of a child, and seeking other people out who have had that same experience, getting involved in some support group would be very helpful, I think.
okay. And you know what? And we gone through this hour so quickly. It's hard to imagine, but it's such a big topic and there's so many layers to it. And I certainly thank you, Stephanie, for being courageous, for being brave, and being vulnerable to come and share your intimate and personal story and your journey through losing a child. And there's no doubt in my mind that other men and women watching this broadcast will be blessed by your testimony and you sharing your experiences, your triumphs, your victories, your losses, your highs and your lows. And so I don't take that lightly, and I truly appreciate you giving your time to do this to bless others. And I just want to encourage our viewers that if you're dealing with grief and loss in any form for any reason, know that there's comfort in strength in others, and it's okay to need help. And you'll be surprised to see how in your weakness you can be made strong through others and even through your faith. And so don't be so hard on yourself. It's okay to cry. It's okay to say I can't do it. And whatever your process is, your process. And people should respect that and give you space to do that. And there are also resources out there for professional counseling. You can also go through your clergy members at your church, your pastor, and pray for one another. And I think sticks out in my mind, the word tells us, wherefore comfort yourselves together and edify one another, even as also ye do. And that comes from First Thessalonians 5:11. And I think we should, there's power in number, there's power in the body. Um, you never know how your life can be changed and revolutionized through someone else. And so we shouldn't be afraid to seek comfort from others, seek comfort from our faith and God. And all of these things used to help us. And so again, I do want to thank Stephanie for being our treasured guest this evening on the platform. And as usual, the platform will be back for you. Um, Next Monday at 7:30. We do have another special show planned for you, and I'm sure our viewers will be blessed by it. If you have any additional questions after this broadcast ends, you can certainly email us at the platform at prayertowerchurch.org, and we will be happy to hear from you. So, again, thank you, Stephanie, for your testimony tonight and sharing it with us. And again, as usual, be blessed to be a blessing. Have a good evening.
You too. Take care.
Thank you.